Hello, welcome to Chapter 3 Podcast, the show for readers of science fiction, fantasy, and romance. This is Season 2, Episode 10, and today me and Leanna are back to continue with our First Law Readalong. Today we're talking about Before They Are Hanged by Joe Abercrombie. So yeah, Book 2, and we'll do some less spoilery and more spoilery sections, I guess, as we did last time for people who...
I think that worked a lot last time, where we talk about the book totally non-spoiler, and then spoilery for the book only, and then spoilery for the book in the context of the trilogy.
Yes, I think we can do that again. So, how many times have you read this book?
Luckily, I know the answer to this because I just finished filming a video talking about all of the times I've read all of these books. This was my fourth time.
Fourth time. Okay. And this was my second time. I have to say, so it's interesting because I know in the last episode that we did for this, I talked about how much more I enjoyed book 1 on a reread. That was not the case with book 2. I felt about the same as I did the first time I read it.
It's funny because in my spoilers for my new ranking for First Law, this is my favorite of the original trilogy now.
Interesting. I'm curious to see how book 3 goes because my first read, book 3, was definitely my favorite.
Same. So
far on a reread, book 1 has bumped up, and book 2, I feel about the same. And you know, we can get into it, but I think there are parts of this book that I love, and then there are parts of this book that I just find uninteresting.
Well, obviously, I find all of it interesting, but the reason that, because it's kind of what I talked about in the video that I just filmed, just sort of how books that are great the first time and also great the second time, or great the first time and not so great the second time, or not so great the first time but great the second time. So there's kind of a big variety, and Abercrombie has one of each. So I feel like, and now having read the trilogy so many times, I already thought that the first two are better on reread than they were before, and I'm coming to now they're better on reread even than the third one. And then between the two of the first and second, Before They Were Hanged, I like slightly better for rereading it all the time, because the first one is still a lot of introducing stuff. And when you're on your fifth time, you're like, okay, I know who these people are. So and the third one, which without spoilers, is the one where you get answers. And getting answers to these burning questions the first time is wow. But then the third or fourth time through, you're like, I mean, okay, but I know the answers. So yay, answers. But the second one, you're not spending a lot of time introducing stuff, and you're not just a bunch of answers that I already know. It's all just playing the games and looking for the clues and all of the foreshadowing and all of the stuff in the world that I can unpack and look for things.
Yeah, I think I do wonder if I had read it more times, I would like book 2 better, because I do think...
Read it twice more, Bethany. Come on, catch up.
I haven't even read all the first books first. Get
on my level.
Oh my gosh. No, but I mean, I can see what you're saying, because I think if you get to the point where you know it well enough that you can pick out all of those things, but I don't think I've read it enough times that I'm familiar enough. I'm familiar enough with the ending that I feel like book 1 was fun because I could pick out so many things, and I didn't so much. There were some, but I didn't as much feel that way about book 2. And there's just a lot of traveling and fighting, which
it is a road trip book.
You know what? That's probably my issue. I tend not to like road trip books, with rare exceptions. So that would explain a lot. And one of my favorite side characters is basically not in the book.
Artie.
Yeah.
I would say if there's a flaw in this book, then it is, that you don't see much of Artie.
Yeah. Agreed.
And there's a lot less. We kind of talked about how, when we were talking about how amazing it is, and I think I talked about this with Heather a bit, how in the first book, you've barely, in terms of page count, you've barely come to learn who these characters are. But he fleshes them out so quickly for you, and you come to think of them as human beings so quickly that by the time they're all meeting in the end of the first one, it's like the Avengers assembling, and you're like, they're meeting, and it's already wow at the end of the first book. But they've now all gone their separate ways again in Before They're Hanged, so there's not much what convergence there was is maintained now on part of the road trip, but there isn't a lot of crossing of paths anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is definitely true. I also think I like the idea and I'm not gonna say too much about this until we get into spoilers, but I like the idea behind what he's doing with book 2, but at least for me, there's parts of it that are more interesting conceptually than interesting to read along the way.
I think you told me, but I forget now because there's different plot lines and different POVs. So like,
Yeah.
which one was it that you liked the best in this
Oh,
one?
definitely Gloctus.
Okay. It was dangerous there for a second, but you saved yourself.
Yeah, no. Gloctus plot is always interesting, and I like the
I would actually,
piece of it.
I kind of talked about this with you. I don't remember if we talked about it on the podcast, but about how much Glocta's plot line in this book is very, very reminiscent of Tyrion's plotline in Clash of Kings in the A Song of Ice and Fire series. So it would be very interesting if and when you someday read the rest of the Song of Ice and Fire, because I think you did read Clash, but like it's been so long.
I did, but it's been a long time.
So like if you picked it up again, because that was me. I mean, I had read all of the Song of Ice and Fire before, but now rereading it, I'm obviously a lot more familiar with First Law than with Song of Ice and Fire. So when I'm reading Tyrion's plotline, I'm going, this is Glocta, instead of, which is actually the case, that Tyrion came first.
Right.
And really, it's Glocta that's like Tyrion.
Right. Yeah, no, it would be fun. It's one of those things, I know they're really long books, but at some point I would like to return to them because I also think I enjoyed them, but I stopped reading because I was uncomfortable with some of the, the more salacious parts of it. But also, I have gotten much more comfortable with reading that kind of thing.
I was gonna say, like, I guess, I mean, it depends on like who the reader is, because like, yes, there is like dark content and salacious content, but then if that person has read First Law, I'm like, well, Song of Ice and Fire ain't got nothing on First Law, so it's not nearly as...
Well, that's the thing. Like, I feel like I would probably be fine with them now, but this was, many years ago when I was still kind of somewhat in the depths of conservatism, and I
was gonna say, this podcast is about First Law, but to like a brief aside about A Song of Ice and Fire, I feel like there's been that quote unquote, I'm using air quotes for those listening, controversy or recurring discussion of like, is A Song of Ice and Fire even grimdark? And people saying it's not grimdark, and I'm like, oh my goodness. Just because, like, that's like saying old horror movies, like Nosferatu or something, like, it's not a horror movie because nowadays our standards have changed and it's not scary anymore. But like, it is still a horror movie.
Yeah.
So like, A Song of Ice and Fire was not the first, but among the first to do grimdark, and have we upped the ante? Have authors come along and been like, I can do it harder, I can do it bloodier, I can do it darker? Yes. But does that mean that A Song of Ice and Fire is not grimdark? No.
Yeah. No, I agree. I don't think, well, and I think when I picked it up, I was used to fantasy with a lot more magic to it, and I wasn't necessarily expecting what it was, but I like all the political stuff. I really do. I need to go back.
I was going to say, to circle then back to First Law. See, while you picked up A Song of Ice and Fire and were like, oh no, oh my, where's the magic? This is awful. Joe Abercrombie picked up A Song of Ice and Fire, was like, you're telling me fantasy doesn't have to have magic and can be extremely dark and political. Well, I best get to writing.
Yep. Yeah, it makes sense too why like First Law. So I do wish there was more magic in it. I get why there's not, but I do. Like, every time we get a hint of it, I'm like,
the new trilogy takes place in an industrial revolution, and so you would think has even less magic. There's arguably more magic in the Age of Madness trilogy.
That's interesting. Yeah, it is for sure a lower magic.
Yeah, I don't want you imagining it's like suddenly turns into a Brandon Sanderson series, because like it's still very low magic. But there's I guess I would say, because like in the original trilogy, right, there is basically a magic user who appears throughout, and so if and when that person uses magic, then there's magic,
right?
And so there is a magic user in the new trilogy, but that person is a POV character and is much more frequently dipping into those waters.
Okay. So you would see a little bit more of it. That's interesting. I'm excited to get on to more things.
Instead of rereading, actually read something new.
Yeah, it'll be nice. But
Me too.
But hey, we're doing this for all the people listening. We've got to like get through this,
and you'll miss Glocta.
Oh, I will. I love Glocta. I love Galacta. Okay, so do you have anything else non-spoilery that you wanna talk about?
I mean, we haven't really talked about anything
I
except
mean,
very general things.
well, that's because I feel like it's hard to not talk spoilers for the book.
I mean, I would say you can still, I mean, the fact that you have a quest and you see the character dynamics and
Mhm.
how they are coming together or not coming together, because it's
Yeah.
kind of staggering how many of the POVs are all in the same place. Like usually you have different POVs to have eyes on different parts of your world, but there's such a cluster of POVs for
Yeah.
like one part of it where like and which is also interesting because a lot of the time you have to take your POV's word for what's going on in a certain area, or
Mhm.
you have to take their, if not necessarily their word for it, but like they've only seen one piece of it, they've seen their piece of it, so that we have such a cluster of perspectives on the quest that you get a very thorough impression from all sides of exactly how this is going and exactly what's happening and who's responsible for what. And
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I think that which it's interesting because, like, that the cluster is in the plot line that I'm least interested in.
I think that, well, that also is the part that, like, because I talked about how it is in rereading it that this has become my favorite. It's not the first time through or even the second time through.
Mhm.
But it's that kind of stuff that is more interesting to come back to as opposed to a
Mhm.
first time through. The first time through you read anything, you're like, what's the plot? What's happening? And then the second time through, you're like, okay, I know what happened. And so like let's pick apart a little bit more about like how that happened and what led to it and who is who. And then the more times you read it, like, okay, you know what's happened and how it happened. You know everything. So the part that you can like really kind of enjoy more is just like the character dynamics and watching them become who they are, and the way that just watching Joe Abercrombie. I mean, the part that we're talking about, that is the sort of quest part where you have a cluster of perspectives. That's the part that is most reminiscent to me of like really good theater, where like the play all takes place in one room and they never go anywhere and nothing actually happens, but the whole play is like a conversation between these people, and suddenly a story unfolds from that because you've watched an entire arc happen for each of these characters as they've been talking to each other. So like it's kind of like that. And I
Mhm.
know what a big fan Joe Abercrombie is of theater and of Shakespeare. So like I wonder how much, well, in general, his love of character work, but like that's what there's so little happening in terms of they are questing, oh, there's food, oh, they've been attacked. Like there's not a lot.
Right.
There's so much happening in terms of the character dynamics shifting and changing and growing, and realizations about themselves and realizations about who the others are,
I mean,
and
that's
like
true.
that stuff.
It's true. Well, and I do think that some of those moments are interesting. It's just kind of, like, blended in with this kind of repetitive quest they're all
Well,
on.
and again, without spoilers, that is the part of it, of the book, where you are getting the most glimpses into the part that you said you wanted more of, the magic, the lore,
Yeah.
which is
Yeah.
where you're getting interesting encounters and interesting tidbits and
It's
interesting
true. It's
bits of
true.
information that
Yeah.
become more interesting when you know things.
I mean, it's true, but I think it's just hard because it's like I'll be like, "Ooh, interesting and boring, and interesting and boring." It's like this, like, like, that's the, like, uh
Well, so since we have such a
yeah.
cluster of perspectives, did you
Mhm.
have a favorite that you preferred to see that part of the story through?
I don't think so. I think there were moments for all of them that were interesting, but I don't think overall I had a preference. I think each of them had their interesting moments and their less interesting
So
moments.
the person that grows the most is obviously Giselle.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So like I would, if I had to choose a favorite in that grouping to follow, it's
Mhm.
Giselle, just because watching how his internal monologue, not even something, a little bit what he says, like you could observe it
Yeah.
from a distance as well, but observing it from inside of his mind, how he thinks about the people that he's with and how he thinks about himself in relation to them, and how he
Mhm.
thinks about his life. And he starts to have he already had a bit of a crisis when he realized that Artie, he's into her because she hates him and he feels he deserves it. And he's like, what?
Yeah.
And then a further existential crisis on this trip when he's like, I think I've wasted my life and been an asshole. Like,
Well
yeah.
well, it's also just funny too, because and I mean, I guess this is, like, mildly spoilery, but, like, It's so funny to me, the thing of him getting injured and just being, like, horrified at his disfigurement.
Well, also, I love Logan's bedside manner at that point
Oh
when
my
he's, like,
gosh,
trying to
yeah.
cheer him up, and then he's
Yeah,
like, "I'm not helping, am I? Okay, I'll stop."
no. So there are, like, moments like that that are just so funny, and I like a lot of the, like, the interactions between, like, Farrah and Baez along the way, and, like, I don't know, there's a lot of, like, great moments scattered.
Just, again, back to his bedside manner, he's like, "That would
Oh
have been
my
a naming
gosh.
wound up into the north. They'd have called you No Teeth or Broke Jaw." And Giselle's like, "What?" And he's like, "So I'm not helping."
Well, I'm trying to encourage him that, like, yeah, like, now you'll have some scars. Women will be more into that because it's like, but when he finally sees his face, he's just like horrified. Oh my gosh. Has a little more empathy for Glockdie, I guess.
I don't know if I'd go that far.
Kinda. Maybe not empathy, but
It's
like,
more that he understands Logan. Understanding Glockner,
yeah.
that's a bridge too far for
Yeah.
Giselle.
Yeah. Fair enough. But yeah, you do. You see him definitely grow and
Well,
change a
just that,
lot.
like, when Logan's it's I love that he asks Logan for advice because he's like, "I get," and he has to justify it to himself. He's like, "I mean, I guess, you would ask a person who's an expert in the thing they're doing, even if they're lowly." So, like, he's clearly done some killing. I guess it's reasonable to ask this guy for advice on killing.
I
And then Logan's
suppose.
advice to him is like, you should always appear to be less than what you are, that you should never underestimate your
Yes.
opponent, but that you should always appear to be less. And then that's when Giselle first has the idea that, like, I never would have thought of that as a strategy, but also
Mhm.
two, wait a minute, is that
Yeah.
what you've been doing? Because it
Yes.
worked.
I loved that. Logan is so interesting because he's so much more than what he seems to be, and I know we talked about that in the
I was
last
gonna say, which is
episode as
something
well.
Baez already points out. But then, like, having
Yeah.
Baez pointed out is one thing. Having Giselle realize it is like a whole
Mhm.
nother layer.
Yeah. And then Pharaoh is like, I am here for what I want, and I don't care what the rest of you are planning."
But tying back to Logan, one of my favorite parts, it's a bit much to say my favorite parts in the trilogy, but it is a favorite part of mine when Logan accidentally overshares about being the Bloody Nine and what that really means. And
Mhm.
everyone's like, are we safe with you? We kind of don't want to be on a quest with you now. And Pharaoh immediately leaps to his defense, and she's the only one that's actually seen the Bloody Nine. And she's like, "You were fine with it when you needed the killing done. So I don't want to hear it from any of you." And Logan's
Yep.
like, "Oh, thank you."
Spoiler warning for the book. Well, and then the two of them, like, because they end up, like, hooking up and are so awkward when they get back.
Awkward is putting it mildly. They are dysfunctional when they get back.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh my
I
gosh.
guess we have ventured into spoilers.
Yeah. I mean, it's fine. It's fine. We're at like 20 minutes almost.
We just didn't really give a warning, but
I mean, is that really like, well, I guess it's a spoiler. I don't know, like, how much it matters.
yeah.
It's not like it's a thing that happens, but I don't know that
Yeah.
it's like, I don't know. People have different ideas of what a
I
spoiler
mean, I say
entails.
technically, is it a spoiler? Yes. But like when it comes to books and stories like this, I feel like spoilers are less of a concern than they are in, say, like a mystery thriller.
Right. Well, especially something like that of characters getting together, because I just don't feel like it's substantially.
Which again, then that's just why the cluster of POVs is amazing, because then they've gotten together, but then when Giselle he's like starting to feel kind of warmly towards Logan, and then he notices that they're banging next to him, and he's like, "How am I expected to endure
Yeah.
this? This is unacceptable."
He's like, how does everybody else just rolling over and ignoring it?
Once again, he's just like very
Uh,
indignant and affronted that like he personally
mhm.
is being hurt by this. That like, have they not considered that Giselle Dan Luther, will be
Yeah.
affected by this?
Right. How dare they not think
Mhm.
about that?
And then I think it ends on him being like, "I'm mad, but mainly lonely,"
Yeah.
because like that's really what's egging him, like,
Yeah.
or that's what's really bugging him. Is like, yes, he's grossed out and annoyed, but the reason that he's so upset about it is because mainly he wishes he was also getting some.
Mhm. Yep. Yep. That's pretty much it.
And their little
So
bonding moment when, like, the one thing they can all agree on is how annoying Brother Longfoot is. When they, like, all take their turn, basically, like, saying something to bother, Brother Longfoot.
oh yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, because he is very annoying.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like it's what this is what I mean when I say it's like I have mixed feelings because I'm like there are things I love and then there's like fights and riding through nothing and I'm like okay. And then I mean we're I think fully we'll say we're like fully doing spoilers at this point for the book, but like their quest results in nothing.
Yeah, I mean, it's an Abercrombie book.
Which
Sometimes when you go on a
Pharaoh was
quest,
so pissed.
sometimes when you go on a quest, you don't find the thing that you were looking for. It happens. There's
And in
never a
this
guarantee.
no, and in this case, it definitely
But it's also a
did not
great
work
moment because,
out.
like, Pharaoh is pissed about it, and Biaz is like, "You're pissed about it? You think you're pissed about it?
Mhm.
You have no idea what pissed is." And all of them are like, "Do we want to be on a boat with him right now?"
Yeah. Yeah, which I think it's, and this is where what I mean is conceptually, I think that's an interesting idea to have them go on a quest that ends up ultimately being meaningless. So maybe the trip getting there was not always the most interesting, but the idea is subversive.
Plus, also, I mean, in terms of it being pointless, like it's pointless because the thing that they were trying to get, they didn't get. But
Right.
it's not. There's things are possible because of this quest that would not have been possible
Mm,
otherwise.
that is true. I mean, there is yeah, like, there's growth, they meet people, they do things, like, it's yeah, so things happen, but it's like the end goal does not.
They didn't get the MacGuffin.
Mhm. And then we have Glokta.
Glocked. My boy, my man.
Mhm.
I love her.
Who gets sent to the city to try to keep it together when it's being attacked,
Slash also investigate what happened to his predecessor.
right?
So he's like, great, whatever happened to him will probably happen to me. So
Yep. So the first time that I read this, I was shocked that the girl was like this creepy thing. Like, did not at all see that coming.
it's also Glockta who never saw it coming. And he's
Mhm.
like, I love that he laughs about it. He's like, he had you. He had you. He was questioning you, and I let you go. This is too good. I'm so glad this is happening. I know I'm going to die, but like, this is too good.
Which is the funny thing about Glokta is he like low-key wants to die and is like kind of bummed when it doesn't happen and has to keep going and it just makes him such an interesting character to be in the head of.
Well, it also makes it funny anytime another character is threatening him because he's like, make my day.
Please try.
Like, what you don't understand is that I want to die. So
Mhm.
try again.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so this time I remembered that there was something weird about the little girl, and, like, so I think I caught more of the foreshadowing of it than I did the first time around. Because the first time I was like, "What? What?" But
I
yeah,
also love
it's
the way
there.
that you always know he's about to see an eater because he has those horrible dreams.
Oh, I did not pick up on that.
He
That's
always dreams about
interesting.
somebody eating him.
Oh, that's interesting. You're right. I hadn't connected that. Huh.
Plus, those dreams by themselves are always like darkly hilarious because
Right.
his in the dream, the logic of dreams, he's always like, "Oh, that tickles," but like, why are you eating my leg? Why? And also, like, why do I have a functioning leg that is being eaten?
Which I guess begs the question too, what does it mean that he has those dreams then before he sees like, that's interesting. Is that s do we ever get any explanation for that at all?
I mean, what's usually like right before an eater is gonna like when what's his name comes to like literally talk to him, like
Yeah.
appears in his room. So I mean, I guess you can chalk it up to premonition. But it's also what enables him the next morning to be like, did I have that conversation, or was that part of the weird dream that I had?
Mm.
And it also suggests the possibility that, like, it might be the case that that person wasn't actually in his room, but that it was real nevertheless, that, like, they were sending him a message through his dreams. So it starts
Oh,
out
yeah.
with him getting his leg eaten, and then he, like, wakes up, but it
Uh-huh.
might be part of the dream, but he's getting actual communication about, like, this is where their ships are, this is where they're coming from, there's somebody who you can't trust, like, and like, he has that in the Blade itself as well, when
Mhm.
he dreams that he's getting eaten, and then someone comes to his room and gives him some vital information. He's like, what in the what? How did you get in here?
That is really interesting. Yeah, I definitely had not put that together, so I'll have to, like, I have to pay attention to that.
So last
Huh.
time you learned that anytime someone has two colored eyes,
Mhm.
it's your soul for. And
Mhm.
now every time someone has an eater dream, they see an eater.
Very interesting. Yeah. I also thought, like, the fact too that he is sent to this city with an impossible task of keeping it safe from attack, and, like, he fails, and yet he's wildly successful because they didn't think he could last a week, and he lasts, like, 2 months, and so what seems like a failure is actually, like, a shocking success.
And of course, he had help.
Yeah, which is going to set us up for book 3.
Will indeed.
Mhm.
But it's also, I mean, that's why Glocta's plotline is also some of it is the most interesting and the most, as a reader who is in the modern day, that's why Glocta is the most satisfying, less as a fantasy and more as like a catharsis for the modern day,
Mhm.
because we enjoyed him being aggravated at his superiors in Dagosca. I'm sorry, in the Agriant.
Mhm.
And now that he is in Dagosca, his frustration with not his own superiors, because he is right now basically, like, if at least nominally in charge,
Mhm.
but unearthing all of the greed and corruption that has set the city up for failure. Like when he asks, well, how much do we have put away for like food stores, and he's like, oh, we have enough to last, what is it, like 6 weeks or 6 months or something like that,
Yeah.
and he's like, oh, okay, well, like, at least we have that sorted. And then the guy's like, well, for the not for the peasants anyway or whatever.
Mhm.
And he's like, wait, I'm sorry, what? Who
Well,
do you
not
have food for? And
yeah,
he's like, just the rich people.
right.
He's like, so what are you gonna do when everybody else is starving? And he's like, it doesn't matter. And he's like, it does matter because they are many in numbers and they will riot.
Well, and I think it's interesting too because it's also clearly kind of like mirroring uh like settler colonialism, because it's like the people indigenous to that place who are like have darker skin, and like I hadn't picked up on all of those elements the first time around, and so it was interesting reading it and catching more of that, and the fact that Glocta, like, sees what's messed up. He sees the oppression, the classism, the way that they've, like, taken away the
But he's not
access they should
exactly
have.
a liberator or a
No.
vigilante.
No. But well, and that's the thing is it's like, for him, he can use it as a tool to get what he wants by saying, "Hey, I'll give you access to your place of worship and, like, stuff
I
if you
mean, it
help me
was
out."
very much sort of like Jerusalem vibes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which, and again, like, the you can argue he's able to use it to use it to his advantage, but also he wouldn't need to use anything to his advantage because we wouldn't be in this situation if they had not behaved this way to the locals in the first place. So like
Right.
him using it to his advantage is really just like setting things kind of back to normal. And it's not, the thing that is so brilliant about it is not him coming in and saying, well, this is just wrong and I don't care
Mhm.
if it's impractical, we must help these people. He's like, I mean, logically speaking, practically speaking, the locals built the wall, so I'm pretty sure they know how, so I
Yeah.
think we should hire them.
Yep.
It just makes sense.
Yeah. And he's like, "I don't care about your, like, elitism and racism. We're
But then
like,
he
this is
also
what
is
we're
like, when the
doing."
local is like, oh, so you think you can promise me the world, and you think that blah blah blah, and Locke's like, I don't care what you think, and I have no morals. What I do know is that I have this thing that you want, so I would like you to work for me, and I can give you this thing. Does that work for you?
Yep. Pretty much. Yeah. And it's also interesting because we see him show mercy, which
Which is also, he shows mercy to the one person who also wasn't, I mean, I guess she was corrupt in a way, but like not corrupt in the way that everyone else was. What she was trying to accomplish was for the greater good. Like she wasn't just trying to line her own pockets. She wasn't just trying to like oppress people and become like the big kahuna. She was trying to make things be as beneficial to as many parties as possible with as little bloodshed as possible. And she's
right.
like, why did you come here and ruin this plan? If my plan had gone through, no one would die, no one would be the worse for it, everyone would be better off. And Glock is
Mhm.
like, that is absolutely 100% true. Also, it's my job to do this, so sorry.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. But it's interesting, and I guess open question of like, should he show mercy or not?
But I feel like at that point, like, should he show mercy or not isn't even the question I'm most fascinated by. It's that,
Mhm.
like, having set up this entire situation the way that Abercrombie did, and that there's somebody corrupt, and that Gokta unearthed who that person was, and you use the locals, like, he could have done all of that and not included the element where she was trying to get this done so that no one would die, so that
Right.
the Empire would not really lose anything of value, so that everyone would be a winner. And that by coming in here and doing his job well, he actually ended up making a lot of people dead. And that if he had just let the conspiracy play out the way that it would have played out if Glokta hadn't been so good at his job, so good at figuring out who's lying and who is corrupt, if he had
Mhm.
just let them be corrupt, everything would have been a lot better for everybody.
Yeah, that's true. But could he do that? No.
Well, he could. His predecessor did.
Yeah. Well, you see where that got him.
I was like, I think it's Ida that also says, your predecessor didn't have your passion for the job. He was fine with it. He's like, oh, just give me a cut.
So yeah, there's a lot of kind of interesting things and more setup that
And there is a
happens.
lot of good sort of mirroring of themes because, like, while Glokta is, like we said, looking at this, corrupt noble who's saying that we have enough food for ourselves, and who cares if the poor people don't have food? And Glokta's like, I don't care because I care about people. I care because they are great in numbers, and it will absolutely affect our lives if they don't have food. Meanwhile, you have Bayaz explaining to people how the love of the common people is what you would need the most. And you can be a king who has the love of the
Right.
nobles, but that won't get you very far if the common people don't love you. So Bayaz is spouting that while you see the exact repercussions
Yeah.
of not caring about the common people in Dagaska. And then you also see what's going on with West, where the people who probably shouldn't be in charge and are absolutely incompetent are in charge and are incompetent. And things do not go well.
Right. Oh yeah, West. We haven't even talked about that.
Where one of my absolute favorite parts of the book happens, where something happens that I don't not condone.
You mean like him basically killing the commander because he was ruining everything?
The prince.
Oh, yeah.
The prince.
The prince.
Because the prince was trying to rape a young woman.
Right.
And West is like, I'm not even furious. I'm just going to kill you.
Yeah.
I'm done with this.
Yeah. Yeah. I did also think it was interesting that there was that girl that West saved who ended up with the dog man, and he was so pissed about it, but she was like, "You're just too angry for me."
And the Northmen literally nickname West Furious. They're like,
Yeah.
Furious! Yeah!
Yeah. So he's like,
He
"I
is.
saved you and you're with him." And she's like,
And after she tells him, you're too angry for me, he's like, he starts to get a headache from rage. Right after she says that, and you're like, I mean, you're proving her point.
she's not wrong. Yeah. Yeah,
And then the
there's a
brilliant
lot of
way
stuff.
that West like maneuvers around his actual commander being under the weather. And
Oh
he's
my
like,
gosh.
do not
Yes.
tell anyone. And anybody that asks, he's like, do this, do this. You don't need to hear from him. You don't need to see him. It's fine. Keep going. We got
Yep.
this.
Yep. Don't derail it. We're doing okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. I'm curious to see how I do with book 3 this time around.
Are we ready for spoilers as concerns the trilogy?
I think so. Yeah. Oh, wait, before we do, we have to do On My Radar before we can do
okay.
trilogy spoilers. So we're going to do On My Radar, talking about upcoming book releases, and then we will do a few minutes of some spoilers related to the entire trilogy. So if you haven't read book 3 yet, you can come back and listen to that part of the episode later. But first, On My Radar is where we share recent or upcoming book releases in sci-fi, fantasy, and romance that we're excited about, or I'm excited. I'm excited about, most likely. The books for today's episode will be released between February 22nd and March 7th, 2022. But first, if you enjoy the podcast, we would appreciate if you could take a moment to rate and review us so we can continue to reach more listeners. And if you are interested in getting early access to episodes and exclusive bonus content with every episode, consider supporting us on Patreon. Huge thanks to all of our supporting patrons, including our world-expanding patrons, Trina and Sarah. You make this possible for us to keep doing this, so thank you. I've got 4 books to talk about today. One of them is coming out February 22nd. This one I've actually already read. It is The Girl Who Fell Beneath the Sea by Axie O. It's a YA fantasy that is kind of a more modern feminist take on a Korean myth that's pretty interesting. The writing is really beautiful, and I think the ending is pretty satisfying, although it does get a little bit meandering through the middle. I think a lot of people are going to like it, though. It's about a girl who sacrifices herself to be the sea god's bride to save her beloved brother's fiance, who was supposed to be the sacrifice, and then she ends up in this like city where she has to try to break a curse that's keeping the sea god asleep, and which is creating storms that's affecting her seaside village and stuff. So anyway, there's a lot going on in it, but I really liked it. So maybe check it out. It's coming out February 22nd. Then we have a few things coming out March 1st. First up is Edgewood by Kristen Ciccarelli. This is another one I've read and really enjoyed. If you like fae stories and like fantasy romance, but want something that's a little smarter and has more thematic depth to it, I guess you could say,
That
than
author
some of the
name
other
sounds
things.
familiar. What else has she written?
She wrote The Last Namsara.
I really like The Last Namsara.
Yeah. That whole series is good. I actually even liked the second 2 companion books in that series better than the first one. They're really
I never
good.
got to those, but I liked The Last Namsara.
Yeah. So this one's interesting because it's set in modern day Canada, but with like fae vibes. She's a Canadian author, and it follows the girl who's a singer-songwriter, but every time she performs, like the forest from her childhood sort of like creeps up. So she'll see like moss and mushrooms growing through the floorboards and stuff, kind of like trying to draw her back. And then she finds out that her grandfather, who raised her and has dementia, has disappeared, possibly into the forest behind her house. So she goes home and goes into the forest to try to rescue him from the court of the Wood King, and ends up kind of pulled into some things. I won't say too much more than that because I don't want to spoil it, but it's got a romance plot. It also deals a lot with like memory and like things we remember and don't, and complicated family relationships and stuff. And it's really beautiful, really kind of lyrical. So I liked that. And then there's 2 coming out March 1st that I've not read yet, but that are on my radar. V.E. Schwab has a new book coming out, Gallant. This one's a gothic horror novel involving a crumbling manor that's haunted, which I'm excited for. It sounds up my alley.
I was gonna say, I've heard that name so many times, and I know what the cover looks like. This is my first time learning that that's what it is.
That's what it is. I think it's YA, but yeah. So I'm excited to check it out. Then we also have The Book of Living Secrets by Madeline Rue. This one is a genre-bending page-turner that follows 2 girls who transport themselves into the world of their favorite book, only to encounter the sinister alternate reality that awaits them. I'm realizing everything I have this time is YA. I didn't have anything else. I was super excited.
I have one.
Yes! Oh, that's exciting. Okay.
There's the 4th book in a series, and
That's
is the 4th book in the Sun Eater series by Christopher Racchio. Book 4, Kingdoms of Death, was pushed back. It was originally coming out March 8th, and now it's coming out March 22nd.
All right. Get it. I love it. Okay, so that is it. With that said, we're going to go ahead and move into some trilogy spoilers.
Yes, or before they are hanged, spoilers that relate to how the trilogy ends.
Right. Do you have anything specific you wanted to talk about?
I feel like we almost did, and then we didn't. We stopped ourselves about Glocta getting a big old loan from the banking house of Valentin Balk.
Yes. which is gonna come back to bite him in the butt.
But also, he couldn't have done any what he did without it.
I mean, it's true. It was like a necessary evil, but it is gonna be an evil.
Which even at the time, without any context, without knowing who the banking house of Valentine Balk is, he's just like, this is a terrible idea, but I have no other idea, and there is nothing else I can do, so yes, I will take this massive, stupidly huge loan.
Yep. And owe you a favor, whatever that means.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as they say so many times throughout before they're hanged, when one is lost in the desert, one must take such water as one is offered.
What are you gonna do?
And it's a good thing Galacta has a death wish, so he's like, sure.
Yeah.
Let's see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah. It is interesting to me too. One thing I was thinking a little bit about is with Giselle, how much he's changed and grown, and yet he's gonna end up being a puppet king.
A puppet king that can still the main thing that's important for Giselle, as far as Baez is concerned, to be successful in his role is to have the like intuitive people sense to where like when he is, because that's the part you can't control, is when he interacts with people, and the people do have to think of him as like a good king for this to work. And so he's learning how to be a good king, not to functionally rule, but to be a good king.
Which is interesting, because it's more about appearances and how people perceive you.
It's the old costume shop. He did stop to get costumes for himself and Logan, and he's working right now very hard on Giselle's costume. Get him some scars, make him a little bit more humble, make sure he understands the plight of the common people.
Right.
Bibbidi bobbidi boo, you got yourself a king.
Look at that. Less of a pretty boy, more of a seasoned warrior that we can trust with the fate of our people.
Yes, a hero.
A hero. On a quest that went nowhere.
It brought us King Giselle.
Mm-hmm.
And we got to meet Baez's sister, little family reunion.
Also, how creepy is that? I guess we didn't even talk about this part, that like, it is unclear. Well, okay. So I guess I have like two thoughts on this. Number one, the book is like less than clear whether they are biological siblings or more just like wizardy siblings. You know what I mean? Like, that is unclear, but they definitely had a affair.
Well, it comes across to me very kind of like biblical, because these are like, they are old beyond reckoning.
Yeah.
And that like the master maker and like great Juvens and everyone, like these are like the starters of the world. So like the idea that like, it's very kind of like, these were the first people, so there is no one but your sister to bang because you're the first.
Yeah. It's still kind of creepy, but it also is reminiscent, because we were talking about how he has taken some inspiration from Game of Thrones. It's a little reminiscent of another brother-sister couple in the Game of Thrones books.
I don't know which one's more toxic.
I mean, it's a toss-up.
But yeah, no, I think it's the way that it's written, though, like it does feel like even when they talk to each other, and that's one of the things that I think Abercrombie does well, which I complain about in a lot of other books that have supposedly ancient characters, where I'm like, okay, but they have the like emotions and thought processes of a 20-something.
Right.
Like you just wouldn't. Like you wouldn't even think like a 50-year-old. Like when you're reckoning in like centuries, the way you think and the way you feel changes. It just does. It doesn't matter who you were to start with. So I do feel like the way that Yulwei and your Sulfur and the way Baez and the way that all of them talk to each other, like I believe that they are as old
that
as
old.
they say they are.
I agree with you. Well, and I think that's part of what the problem with Baez is because he is so old and has seen so much and does have such like a big picture view of things. He doesn't value individual people anymore.
Well, it's very Ozymandias from Watchmen.
I have not seen Watchmen.
Or Red Watchmen.
Or Red Watchmen.
Graphic novel. Well,
I have
brief spoilers for Watchmen, but like that's basically what one of them does is like it's like doomsday but for the greater good. And because they've decided that the math of millions, this is the greater good.
Right.
So that's what Baez is doing. He's done the math
Mhm.
of millions and is like, this is the greater good, and I've decided. And
Yep.
I mean, I asked Joe Abercrombie where the name The First Law came from, because like, I mean, obviously like it mentions it, like it's not like I don't know what the first law is, that's in the
Right.
books. But like when I think of what the series is as a whole, when I think of the universe of these books, when I think of what, you know, what they're like and what's in them, I don't know that I come away from the series going, well, you got to call that the first law. I'm just like, that's in it, but like, is that, in what way is that like the thesis of this series? And he, well, his first answer was like, well, I needed a name, and I was flipping through, and one of the chapters is called The First Law, and I was like, that would be a good name. But part two of that answer, the more serious answer, was that yes, the first law is that you cannot touch anything from the other side, but that as far as he's concerned, like, or as far as Baez is concerned, that the actual first law is that might makes right, and that the only law is Baez's law. It is the first and only law.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, the first law.
Interesting. Yeah.
There is Baez's way, and there is the highway.
And people will fall in line or be taken off the board.
Or you're Pharaoh and you're grudgingly dragged along.
Right. Yeah. Which I think is interesting, right? Because he needs her to some extent.
He no longer needs Logan.
Right.
He
But
only needs...
But he needs Pharaoh, and she's kind of a wild card.
Yeah, well, he wouldn't have chosen her if he had other options.
Right.
Which is why she keeps mouthing off to him. And he's like trying to make her scared of him like everyone else is. And she's already figured out. She's like, you need me, so what are you going to do?
Yep.
He's like,
which is kind of amazing.
Yeah. Which, I mean, there's also just talking about like world building and how you make something actually seem, you know, impressive. And for, I mean, again, there's not a lot of magic and there's not a lot of that kind of stuff in it. But when it's there, part of what makes it stand out and feel so like earth shattering is how rare it is, that you're not just like people just like shooting magic powers all over the place. Like, you know, it kind of loses its impact. But, and we talked now about how Baez and the gang, they feel old, they feel ancient beyond reckoning. But there's also the little ways that like things are, instead of telling us like how like intense it would be to be like, you know, a demon or whatever, they just explain why they need Pharaoh and that she's got a bit of demon in her, and that like that's a part of the other side, and that's why she can do whatever they can do. And Logan or Giselle, one of them is like, so she's half demon, and he's like, half? Oh my god, no! Like, what's his name? He was half, and he like destroyed everything. No. She's got like the teeniest, tiniest, little drop, and like even with that, she can do what she can do. Where Logan's already impressed with how she can shoot, and like the thing she sees, and the fact that she can hold the seed, and you're like, the teeniest, tiniest fragment of a drop has that much of an effect on her.
Yeah. I mean, you do, I think, really get a sense of the history of the world. And even though like so much of the magic is not really present anymore, but you get a lot of this lore of like these past eras where there was a lot more of it. And I do think he does a good job of...
But I think it also, like, by the few times you do see it and the way it's talked about, it really does leave you with the impression that like magic is not something you want to fuck with. Like, it's when it's there, you're gonna wish it wasn't, because it is not small. It is not something that like, oh, wouldn't it be great if that? No, absolutely not. Because like the once or twice that Baez breaks out some magic, even he kind of like has trouble containing it. And then like all the little things, like again, the tiniest drop of demon in Pharaoh has this effect on her. And then like Logan like never has to sharpen his sword, and he's like, yeah, well, he was the master maker for a reason. Like, that's like, again, the barest hint of like what he could do. And we've already seen the House of the Maker, which makes no kind of sense.
Yep.
So like it's these little things where you're like, yeah, no, I saw some magic and I'm good. No magic, please.
Just stay away from that. Yeah. Yeah, it'll be interesting to read, because I want to say, and again, like I've only read it once and it's been a while, but I want to say there's a place where magic shows up in book 3 that like the thing that it reminded me of is like in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there
That's just like First Law.
No, but in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, like one thing that people talk about, which I think is accurate and funny, is there's like these giant, battles in the middle of New York City and tons of
The giant
property
siege.
damage and like all this stuff. And there's like no discussion of like insurance or like how it affects the people who own
Who's
those
going to clean up
properties.
all of
Right.
Spider-Man's webs?
Yeah, that too. And so I want to say there's something in book 3 where it focuses a little bit on that, on like the aftermath of the destruction from magic, and like, oh, now we have to actually deal with all of this mess. So I don't know, it reminded me a little bit of how that gets glossed over.
Well, I mean, sort of like, I think in general, that's something that Abercrombie's interested in, and is interested in it, and is also interested in the fact that this is a thing that is never explored, and that is just consequences. Like, he's always interested in consequences. And most stories, or I shouldn't say most, but far too many, want to tell you everything other than the consequences. And so, like, Glocta himself is an embodiment of living with consequences. And like, no, like, you don't get Gloctas in most books, but like, you have the man of violence, you have the warrior, you might have him even be injured in battle, and he comes home and he's got, a scar on his face, and like, maybe like he needs, a little bit of a cane because his leg is like a little bit rough. But like, you have somebody who was handsome and good at what he did, like he was the best, and he was a prisoner of war, and he came back shattered. And now you actually have to follow that character. You can't just be like, oh, people die in war, and isn't that sad? And our heroes are very sad about it, about how those other people over there that are not our POV characters over there, isn't that so sad that they got shattered in war? No. We're going to follow Glocta. And we're going to watch the consequences of a life of violence and what that does to you. Logan tells us over and over again that his past is one of violence. And the first thing he tells Giselle is that his like first bit of advice is like, don't get into a life of violence. Don't kill people. Go settle down and don't ever do this, because I don't have a life anymore, because I was really good at killing and now I have nothing but enemies.
Yeah.
So, and then like, as you say, like when there is actually magic used, there are consequences. When there is destruction, there are consequences. So, yeah.
Yep. I agree. I think he does a good job. All right. Anything else? Yeah. All right. So I think that'll do it. We will be back next month to discuss the third and final volume of this trilogy before moving on to the rest of the First Law series. So thanks for joining us. Hope you guys are reading along and enjoying the conversation. This has been Chapter 3 Podcast. We're your hosts, Bethany and Leanna, and you can follow us at Chapter 3 Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. And you can also find us on our individual YouTube channels, which is linked in the show notes or in the video description if you're watching us on YouTube. The next episode will be available in 2 weeks. I will be back with Izzy, and we're going to be talking about the Crescent City series by Sarah J. Maas. Yes, roll your eyes at us, Leanna. It's fine. We enjoy it. So we just did a buddy read of House of Earth and Blood. It was her first time reading it and my second time, and book 2 is about to come out, so we're going to read that.
I would just like it to be known that I got a Jeopardy question on Alan's Bookish Jeopardy correct. That was Crescent City.
That is impressive.
Thank you.
Way to go. So we'll be back in 2 weeks to talk about the series, books 1 and 2, if you want to join us. And this episode's bonus content will be available to patrons in the next few days. Thanks for listening.